Hey there. Tonight I want to begin with a quiet image. Imagine a world before any temple rose from sand, before any priest traced a symbol into wet clay, before any mother lifted a child toward a bright morning sky. There is only dark water, endless and still. Water so old it does not yet know the moon. Water so deep it seems to be thinking in its sleep. And somewhere above that sleeping blackness, though above and below do not really exist yet, a single intention begins to tremble. If you enjoy these slow journeys into old stories, leave a like and subscribe, and settle in with me now. This one carries us toward a goddess who will search riverbanks for a murdered husband, hide a divine child in whispering reeds, and teach even death that it is not quite as final as it likes to pretend. Now let the room grow dim. Let your shoulders unlearn the day. Let your jaw soften. Let your breathing become a small tide, coming in, going out, coming in again. We are going very far back, to the first hush, to the beginning of the Egyptian world, and to the long shadow where Isis first opened her eyes. At first, there is none, not a god in the simple way later minds might like, but a vast, sacred deep, a condition as much as a place. It is water without riverbank, darkness without horizon, silence without listener. If you were standing there with me, or perhaps floating there with me would be more accurate, you would see almost nothing, yet the nothing would not feel empty. It would feel crowded with possibility, as if creation were holding its breath under a black blanket and waiting for the right moment to move. Then Atum rises from that endless sleeping flood. He is self-made, self-gathered, the first will to become something definite. I have always found it strange, and oddly comforting, that so many old myths begin not with certainty but with loneliness. The first being stands up in the dark with no applause, no witness, no map, and still chooses to create. There is something very brave in that, something almost human, which is funny considering humanity is still a very distant idea. From Atum come Shu and Tefnut, air and moisture, dryness and rain, space to breathe, and the coolness that keeps breath from turning cruel. They are not just children in a family line. They are conditions of existence. With them, the cosmos begins to separate itself into textures. The first gap opens. The first softness gathers. The universe starts to feel less like a sealed jar and more like a room that might one day hold living things. From Shu and Tefnut come Geb and Nut, earth and sky, matter below and the endless arch above it. Geb stretches out dark and fertile, his body heavy with hills, riverbeds, valleys, and the waiting promise of green life. Nut curves over him, luminous and star-covered, her long body making the first ceiling over the world. The image is beautiful, but it is also a little sad. They long for each other, these two, earth and sky, and yet their union must also be a separation, because only in the space between them can life begin. The old stories linger here for a reason. They enjoy the shape of this first family, because divine genealogy in Egypt was never just family gossip at a heavenly table. It was a map of reality, air and moisture making earth and sky, earth and sky, producing the powers that would govern life, death, kingship, storm, mourning, healing, and the strange hidden roads between worlds. In that sense, every birth is also an invention. Every child is a principle given a face. Then come the 4 children of Geb and Nut. Osiris first, then Set, then Nephthys, and finally Isis. The order matters. The atmosphere matters. Ancient storytellers were very good at making birth feel like prophecy. Osiris enters the world with the quiet gravity of a ruler already half remembered. Set follows with the restlessness of heat over stone, necessary but dangerous. Nephthys carries dusk around her like a shawl, soft, watchful, and shadow-kind. Then Isis arrives, and the air itself seems to sharpen. Her birth is not ordinary. If anything in such a family could ever be called ordinary, the heavens align in ways later priests will speak of in whispers and diagrams. The stars seem to pause in their courses. The hidden currents beneath visible reality stir. Some said light pooled around the newborn child like water gathering in a hollow. Some said the unseen words by which gods shaped the world grew suddenly easier to hear. It is debated, of course, because ancient people loved a dramatic birth story almost as much as modern people love a scandal. Still, even the most cautious traditions agree on this. Isis did not enter the cosmos quietly. Something answered her arrival. As she grows, it becomes clear that her gifts are unlike those of her siblings. Osiris is noble in the bright, visible way. Set is powerful in the blunt, undeniable way of storm and desert wind. Isis is different. Her power is not loud at first. It hides in attention, in the way she listens longer than others, in the way her eyes seem to notice the thread connecting one event to another. While the others learn by doing, she appears to remember things no one has taught her. Not facts exactly. Patterns. Structures. The grammar beneath existence. Picture her as a young goddess moving through the halls of the divine household. The floors are cool stone. Lamps burn with steady gold along the walls. Incense lifts in pale ribbons and disappears into the dim spaces near the ceiling. Servants move quietly. Priests murmur. Somewhere beyond the columns, reeds rustle by black water. And there is Isis, pausing at the edge of a pool, watching how reflected torchlight breaks and reforms when a single drop falls into the surface. Other children might see a pretty distortion. She sees law. She sees that image is never only image. That movement can carry meaning. That repetition can become power. Honestly, this is one of the things that makes her so compelling. She is not merely strong. Many gods are strong. She is curious in a dangerous way. Curious people are always more unsettling than violent people, because they keep going until they find the hidden hinge on which the whole door swings open. Her first famous acts of magic are small by later standards, but already uncanny. During one gathering, she causes shadows to move a fraction later than the bodies that cast them, just enough for everyone watching to feel that reality has slipped by a hair. At another moment, she shapes lamplight into patterns that seem decorative, until a wiser observer realizes they form a message. She learns very early that symbols are not decorations placed on the world after meaning exists. Symbols are part of how meaning enters the world at all. This becomes the center of her education, though education is perhaps too weak a word. She studies speech itself. She experiments with sounds, breaths, intervals, and names. Certain words, when spoken lazily, are only words. Spoken with knowledge, alignment, and intention, they become tools. Not tools like a hammer or knife, obvious and blunt, but tools like keys, or perhaps like seeds. A tiny thing placed correctly can open a chamber. A tiny thing planted correctly can split stone with roots over time. Isis learns which sounds belong to change, which to protection, which to healing, which to unveiling what prefers to remain hidden. She also studies matter. The stones, resins, metals, threads, bird feathers, river clay, bone. She discovers that materials remember where they come from, and that shape matters almost as much as substance. An amulet is not powerful because someone wishes very hard at it. That would be convenient, but the universe is usually ruder than that. No, an amulet becomes powerful when proportion, symbol, material, and rite join together correctly. A curve just so. A knot tied in the right order. A name spoken at the right hour beneath the right star. She begins creating objects that hold a fraction of divine force in stable form. And that is no small achievement. To contain power without breaking it, or being broken by it, is one of the great arts. Her healing studies unfold with the same quiet intensity. Others may treat wounds. Isis asks why flesh and spirit ever drift apart enough for wounding to happen. She watches fevered breathing. She studies herbs in marsh and desert. She listens to the pulse behind the wrist and to the pulse beneath spells. She comes to understand that illness is not always an invader. Sometimes it is a misalignment, a quarrel between body and essence, a disharmony that must be persuaded back toward balance. Her remedies become famous because they do more than close cuts or lower heat. They restore correspondence. They remind a body how to belong to itself again. She does not stop there. Of course, she does not. The sky calls to her. Nut arches over the world every night, and Isis reads that great starry body as if it were a text written for anyone patient enough to stay awake. She charts celestial rhythms. She notices that the heavens do not merely decorate time. They measure it, flavor it, bend it. Some hours are open. Some are resistant. Some nights are fertile for transformation. Some are best for concealment. She learns to time her workings to the great breathing of the cosmos, and her success rate rises until even the older gods begin to glance at her with something like caution. There are numbers in all this too. Egypt, like many ancient places, knew that number is not a dry, abstract thing. Number is character. Number is tendency. Number is relation made visible. Isis notices ratios repeating in flowers, shell curves, crystal forms, flood cycles, and celestial intervals. She begins using these numerical harmonies in her rites, shaping temples of thought before temples of stone. A charm made with the wrong proportion feels dead in the hand. One made with the right proportion hums softly. as though it contains a sleeping bee. By the time she has grown fully into herself, she is already unlike anyone else in the pantheon. Other deities possess mighty domains. Yes. Storm, fertility, sky, sun, war, morning. Each rules something visible and grand. Isis rules the hidden operations that make all such rule possible. She understands how power is woven. That is more unnerving and more important. Her appearance reflects this layered nature. She is beautiful, naturally, because old myths are extremely generous with divine cheekbones. But what people remember most is not the symmetry of her face or the elegance of her form. It is the feeling around her, the sense that she is listening not only to your words but to the silence around them. Her gaze can feel cool as river water at dawn, then suddenly warm as lamp flame through woven linen. Her beauty does not ask to be admired. It makes admiration feel inevitable, which is a very different thing. Within the Heliopolitan order, she becomes indispensable. The major gods understand that raw force and official authority do not solve everything. Some problems are too subtle, too tangled, too deeply rooted in unseen causes. When these arise, the household turns toward Isis. She notices what others miss. She anticipates consequences before they ripen. She sees the hairline crack before the wall falls, the hidden resentment before it becomes revolt, the imbalance in ritual before the harvest weakens. Her wisdom is not merely abstract. It is useful, and useful wisdom is always the kind rulers value most. Yet for all her brilliance, these early years are not grim. I do not want to paint her as a joyless prodigy stalking corridors with 12 scrolls under one arm and a permanent frown. There is warmth in her too. Humor. Grace. I suspect she would have had little patience for the pompous. One imagines her hearing some lesser god boast too loudly about a trick with lightning, then quietly turning a cup of water into a mirror that reveals the speaker with goat ears for a heartbeat or two. Just enough to make a point. Just enough to improve the evening. And slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, another presence begins to matter more than the rest. Osiris, elder brother, bright ruler in waiting, associated with renewal, growth, law, and the fruitful green life of earth. Where Isis knows the hidden mechanism, Osiris knows how to make goodness visible. He does not merely understand order. He makes others want to live within it. That is rare. Very rare. Many can command. Few can invite and still be obeyed. So the stage is set before anyone quite says it aloud. The goddess of hidden wisdom and the god of fertile kingship are moving toward one another, as inevitably as river water toward the sea. And if we linger here a little longer, in the quiet before their love becomes the center of the world, we can feel the first turning of the great wheel. Because stories like this do not begin with betrayal. They begin with radiance. They begin with a world becoming so beautiful that its fracture will matter. And in the next hush of this tale, beneath star fields and along the breathing Nile, Isis will meet the one soul who can stand beside her without shrinking from her depth. And together they will build an age so luminous that even the desert will grow jealous. Osiris does not arrive in Isis's life as a surprise. Not really. He has always been there, a bright fixed presence within the architecture of the divine house, like a column one stops noticing because it has never failed. Yet there comes a point in every old story when someone familiar begins to glow with a different kind of meaning. A face once known becomes newly seen. A voice heard 1,000 times suddenly carries a second note beneath it. That is where we are now, in that soft, dangerous change. If Isis is the keeper of hidden workings, then Osiris is the calm, visible proof that hidden workings can become a just world. He is composed, fertile in spirit as much as in field, the sort of being who makes a room quieter simply by standing within it, not because anyone is afraid, but because everyone feels, however briefly, that order might actually be possible. His skin is the green of renewal in many tellings. The dark, luminous green of reed shoots after floodwater, withdraws, the color of leaves fresh with river breath. In his hands he carries the symbols that later kings will imitate, crook and flail, not as empty ornaments, but as promises. To guide, to correct, to protect, to nourish. Even before he rules, he moves like someone already measured against that burden. I have always thought that Isis must have recognized in him not just beauty or status, but compatibility. That is a rarer thing. Power often recoils from power, or attempts to dominate it. Yet Osiris is not threatened by her depth. He listens. He asks. He understands that what Isis knows is not decoration. It is foundation. Their closeness deepens through work before it deepens through vow. They meet in the labor of ordering the world. Osiris is concerned with justice, governance, the visible structures by which communities can flourish. Isis is concerned with what those structures require beneath the surface. Trust, timing, ritual coherence, protection against unseen fracture. He thinks in terms of fields, laws, harvests, roads, institutions. She thinks in terms of resonance, motif, imbalance, omen, and repair. Together they begin solving problems neither could solve so elegantly alone. Imagine them walking along the Nile at evening. The banks are cool with recent shade. Papyrus stems brush against each other in dry, soft whispers. In the west, the sky lowers itself slowly into amber, then rose, then deepening blue. Waterbirds lift and settle. Silt darkens the edges of the river where the flood has recently gone, leaving behind that rich black smell of wet earth and possibility. Osiris points out where channels might be widened to ease irrigation for distant settlements. Isis kneels and touches the mud, feeling not only the moisture, but the shape of the coming season in it. He sees roots. She sees rhythms. He sees what can be built. She sees what must be protected to keep it from quietly failing. Their conversations lengthen. They turn from practical matters into questions larger and stranger. What makes a law just rather than merely effective? Whether fear can ever create a stable realm or only a silent one? How much knowledge should be shared, and with whom? Whether magic belongs inside governance or beside it? Osiris thinks aloud, measured, generous, patient. Isis answers with that exact sharp intelligence that cuts confusion cleanly without cutting the speaker. There is admiration between them. Yes, but also relief. Relief at being understood without reduction. When the divine household notices the shape of this bond, no one is particularly shocked. In some stories, the union of Isis and Osiris feels almost predetermined, woven into the first architecture of creation. Earth and sky produce children whose destinies lean toward one another. Wisdom and kingship, hidden force and visible order. The pair fit with the quiet rightness of two lines meeting at the angle for which they were always intended. Their marriage is not treated as a minor domestic joy. It is a cosmic event. The ceremony gathers the great powers of the divine realm. Air is perfumed with incense, heavy and sweet enough to cling to hair and cloth long after the vows are spoken. Gold catches in firelight. Musicians draw long, trembling notes from strings and flutes so that the room itself seems to breathe with them. Sacred words are spoken slowly, because sacred words hate being rushed. The floor beneath their feet is strewn with blossoms, and the scent of crushed petals rises when they move. Outside, the river goes on, flowing, immense and indifferent, and somehow also consenting. The vows matter beyond emotion. These are not simply promises of affection. They are alignments. Isis and Osiris bind themselves to one another at several levels at once. Personal, royal, ritual, cosmic. Their union joins not only two beings, but two modes of power. The active hand and the knowing mind. The throne and the unseen ward around the throne. The crop in the field and the spell that protects the field from blight. In that sense, their marriage is architecture. It becomes a framework the world can live inside. Then comes the rain itself, and with it one of the most luminous seasons in Egyptian myth. Under Osiris and Isis, the world grows easier to inhabit. Not easy in the silly sense, but easier in the profound sense. More coherent, more trustworthy. There is enough grain, enough water, enough fairness, enough skill, enough meaning. The great machine of life begins, for a little while, to sound as though every piece has been cleaned and oiled. Osiris takes the visible center. He establishes laws that are clear without being cruel. Cruelty often enjoys disguising itself as simplicity. Osiris avoids that trap. His judgments are steady, proportionate, and grounded in restoration rather than display. He understands that the point of rule is not to make subjects tremble, but to make ordinary life possible. Fields should be tilled without fear. Traders should travel without constant theft. Families should sleep at night without wondering which official will ruin them by morning. His concern for agriculture becomes one of the signatures of his rule. He teaches methods that work with the flood instead of merely enduring it. The Nile rises and falls according to its ancient breathing, and Osiris learns how to guide labor around that pulse. Channels are cut where they should be cut. Embankments are strengthened where weakness once wasted water. Grain is stored more wisely. Soil is treated as a living partner rather than a brute surface to be exhausted. Under his guidance, fertility ceases to be a lucky season and becomes a managed blessing. Isis stands beside all this, rarely in front, though never truly behind. Her genius moves through the structures Osiris establishes like lamp oil through woven wick. Without her, the flame would be dimmer and less reliable. She develops protections around settlements, not dramatic walls of thunder, but delicate networks of wards, signs, and ritual timings that reduce illness, calm unrest, and prevent misfortune from gaining an early foothold. She studies where a village is built, which wines touch it first, where standing water may sour, which stars preside over its founding. She advises where to place shrines, wells, storehouses, and sleeping quarters. Her interventions are often invisible to the people who benefit from them, which is usually the fate of the best work. The two of them also transform learning. Under their rule, schools and temple spaces begin to open more widely. Skill is valued. Capacity. Dedication. Isis especially insists that knowledge cannot remain locked forever in a few hands if a realm is to flourish. She understands that ignorance is one of chaos's favorite hiding places. So instruction spreads. Scribes are trained with more care. Healers learn not merely recipes, but principles. Builders understand why an angle matters. Farmers learn the timing of stars as well as the timing of mud. Everything becomes a little more integrated, as though the kingdom is gradually waking up to the fact that material life and sacred life were never separate to begin with. The legal system reflects this same blending of firmness and intelligence. Disputes are not solved simply by asking who is strongest or who arrives with the louder voice. Evidence matters. Intention matters. Restoration matters. Osiris and Isis both distrust punishment for its own theatrical pleasure. Public cruelty often masquerades as moral seriousness. Their rule resists that. When possible, wrongdoers are corrected, compensated, taught, and reintegrated. When harm must be answered more severely, it is answered without vanity. The point is always balance restored, not egos fed. Temples flourish during this period too, but they are not merely places where frightened people bribe the heavens and hope for favorable weather. Under Isis and Osiris, temples become centers of learning, healing, ritual practice, and community coherence. Priests and priestesses are expected to be competent, not simply ceremonial. Sacred office should know how to help. The ordinary people of the realm feel all this in their bones before they could ever describe it in theory. They sleep a little easier. Their labor yields more. Their dead are mourned with greater dignity. Their children grow up in a world where law is not automatically an enemy. One of the greatest luxuries is not wealth, but a system that is not actively trying to ruin you. So naturally, because stories love symmetry, and envy is one of the oldest shadows in creation, there is someone watching all this with a heart slowly turning sour. Set. At first, his displeasure may not seem dramatic. It begins in comparison. That ancient poison. He sees Osiris praised where he is feared. He sees Isis admired where he is merely endured. He sees the world becoming more stable under principles he privately despises. Set is not without power. He commands storms, desert force, disruption, the fierce energies that can destroy but also clear the way for change. In a balanced cosmos, he might have remained a necessary edge, a harsh but useful force. but he cannot bear subordination to a beauty he does not share. What bothers him most is not just that Osiris rules. It is how Osiris rules. Gently, successfully, beloved. A tyrant can tolerate many things, but not being compared unfavorably to goodness. The collaborative nature of Isis and Osiris's reign only worsens the wound. Set sees in their partnership an implicit insult. They do not need the kind of force he offers. They solve with insight what he would solve with terror. They persuade where he would threaten. They heal what he would break. If you were standing in the edge of one of those bright royal halls and glanced toward him, you might notice the first small signs. The smile that does not quite reach the eyes. The silence held half a beat too long. The hand tightening around a ceremonial staff. The way he leaves celebrations early, under some excuse involving desert matters or storm obligations. Old resentment rarely announces itself. It ferments. And yet, inside the glowing center of their marriage, Isis and Osiris continue building. They cannot quite imagine the scale of the shadow gathering beyond the lamp circle. When a world grows coherent, it becomes easy to believe coherence is natural and may simply continue by virtue of deserving to continue. But beauty is often most vulnerable when it is busiest being beautiful. There are evenings when Isis sits beside Osiris after long hours of rule and research. The palace has quieted. Servants pass softly in distant corridors. Outside, the Nile carries moonlight in broken silver ribbons. A low wind moves the curtains. On a table nearby rests a half-finished charm, a rolled legal decree. A cup of wine, gone nearly untouched, because the two of them have been talking instead of drinking. She studies his face by lamplight. He asks her what troubles her. She says perhaps nothing clear, only a slight sense of pressure in the order of things, as if a note somewhere has begun to flatten. He smiles in that patient way of his and places one hand over hers. The moment is small, almost domestic, but it trembles with the sadness of all we know is coming. He trusts too much. She sees too much. Between those two truths lies the break in the world. For now, though, let us remain a little longer inside their golden reign. Let the fields stay green a moment more. Let the laws remain fair. Let the temples smell of oil, ink, and clean linen. Let the people still believe that justice can settle permanently over a kingdom like warm light over river water at dusk, because soon a banquet hall will glitter too brightly. A gift will appear. Laughter will lift, and then stop. A lid will close on everything. And when that moment comes, it will matter, because what is being destroyed is not merely a king, but the most graceful harmony the world has yet known. Set learned how to wear patience the way other gods wore linen, smooth on the outside, slightly unbearable underneath. In the courts of the divine household, he no longer argued openly with Osiris at every turn. He had discovered that open resistance only made his brother appear calmer, wiser, more beloved. It was intolerable. So he changed tactics. He began to praise what he secretly hated. He nodded in counsel. He raised his cup at feasts. He let compliments pass his lips like coins he intended to steal back later. That was the truly dangerous moment. Not when he raged, but when he became careful. Set could not bear the way the kingdom breathed under Osiris. That was the problem at the center of him. The land did not merely obey Osiris. It relaxed around him. Farmers trusted the flood again. Scribes wrote with steadier hands. Mothers slept more deeply. Even temple cats seemed less offended by existence. It was a kind of power Set had never possessed. He could terrify. He could scatter. He could crack the sky open and make men kneel in storms. But he could not make the world willingly soften. So the bitterness in him ripened. It became organized. He studied Osiris carefully. Not just his public habits, but the private ones. What pleased him? What disarmed him? What appealed to that generous, trusting nature which assumed, or even after strain, that family could still be family? Osiris did not move through life suspiciously. He believed in order so deeply that he sometimes mistook his own goodness for a stable law in others. It is a lovely trait in a ruler, and a dangerous one in a brother. Set gathered craftsmen in secret. He wanted a chest, but not merely a chest. He wanted something irresistible, something beautiful enough to override instinct, something that could present itself not as threat, but as tribute. It would have to flatter Osiris, enchant the watching guests, and function perfectly in one terrible instant. The wood chosen for it was rare and fragrant, imported from distant lands where trees grew slowly and held the smell of sun-warmed resin in their deep grain. Gold was worked into the outer surface in slender lines. Precious stones were set into fitted hollows. The decoration was magnificent without becoming gaudy. Vanity would have made the trap suspicious. Beauty made it plausible. Most carefully of all, he measured. He watched Osiris at ceremony and rest, at banquet and audience, at prayer and procession. He studied the line of his shoulders, the length of his limbs, the exact noble proportion of the body that had become the visible grammar of kingship. The chest was built to those dimensions and to no others. It was less a gift than a second skin waiting for its owner to step into it. Its lid appeared heavy but elegant. Its inner lining was soft, keter, linen, worked cushioning, pleasant fragrance, all the things that turned confinement into invitation. Hidden inside, the locking mechanism waited with quiet patience. One movement, one dropped lid, one swift set of hands, and the beauty would become prison. Then Set chose the occasion. He announced a banquet in honor of peace, prosperity, divine unity. All the usual noble phrases that sound especially convincing when spoken by someone preparing a crime. Invitations traveled through the halls. Musicians were summoned. Tables were dressed with polished vessels that reflected lampfire in trembling gold and amber. Wines were cooled. Fruits were heaped high. Roasted birds, glazed with honey and herbs, shone under oil light. The evening was arranged to feel generous, almost tender. Isis noticed the effort. She may even have found it strange, but strangeness is a subtle warning, and subtle warnings are easy to lay aside when the world has rewarded trust for so long. Osiris certainly did. He accepted the feast as a gesture of reconciliation, perhaps a little overdue, perhaps a little theatrical, but welcome. That was his nature. He preferred healing a crack to admiring it. Night settled richly over the palace. The sky outside was dark velvet. Inside, torchlight and lamp fire pooled on stone floors and rose into carved columns. Incense drifted through the hall in pale blue threads. Musicians played low at first, then brighter. Laughter rose. Cups touched. 100 small civilized sounds gathered into that false sense of safety that only exists a moment before it disappears. Set moved among the guests with perfect control. He smiled, which on him always felt slightly like a door being shut very quietly. He welcomed allied deities, greeted attendants, praised the cooks, complimented the singers, and played the gracious host so well that even those inclined to distrust him found little solid on which to rest their suspicion. Osiris and Isis entered together, and the rooms seemed to settle around them as rooms always did. Osiris carried that easy majesty of his. Isis wore white linen, so fine it looked almost like moonlight folded into cloth, and the gold at her throat and wrists answered the fire with a dim, steady glow. She took in the room with one slow glance, noticing everything: the angle of the servants, the route between doors, the way Set's allies seemed a touch too placed. But the signs remained only signs. Nothing yet had hardened into certainty. The feast unfolded. There were songs in praise of the flourishing land. There were dishes from the river and the desert edge, soft breads, dates, figs, lentils, fragrant with cumin, and wine dark as garnet in shallow cups. There were stories retold with the warm exaggeration that comes after eating well. There were performers whose hands moved faster than sight, making small feats of skill seem magical, and small feats of magic seem like games. Set allowed the joy to ripen before he introduced the object at the center of his plan. Timing matters in every ritual, holy or wicked. Too soon, and the room is alert. Too late, and the room grows dull. He chose the perfect middle point, when everyone was pleased, curious, and softened by celebration. With a host's easy smile, he called for the chest to be brought forward. Servants entered carrying it with visible strain, because even deception enjoys a touch of theater. The chest glimmered as it crossed the floor. Gold flashed in the firelight. Jewel inlay caught red, green, blue, and white from the lamps. A murmur passed through the hall. Admiration first, surprise second, desire third. Set spoke warmly. He said he had commissioned this wonder to honor the prosperity of the age and the greatness of those gathered. He said it seemed a pity for such a masterpiece to belong to no one. He said, in the spirit of play, that the one who fit it best should receive it as a prize. There was laughter then, amused surprise, a little harmless confusion. It was absurd enough to lower caution and elegant enough to keep attention. Several guests volunteered first, emboldened by wine and by the simple fact that others were watching. One god reclined inside and found it too short, another too narrow, a courtier too slight, a noble too broad. Each attempt fed the room's entertainment. Each failure sharpened the sense that the chest was mysteriously meant for someone. Set measured them with exaggerated seriousness, shaking his head with comic sorrow as one by one they failed to fit. Even Isis allowed herself a brief smile at the foolishness of it. The hall warmed further. The trap became shared amusement. At last the guests urged Osiris forward. He resisted only lightly. It would have seemed churlish not to participate after so many others had done the same. He rose with that easy grace of his and crossed the hall. I imagine Isis watching him then, perhaps with a private affection that had nothing to do with omens or politics. Simply the familiar pleasure of seeing him move through light. Osiris lowered himself into the chest. And of course he fit. Perfectly. The room erupted in delight. Laughter. Applause. Calls of approval. It was too exact not to seem marvelous. His shoulders settled into the line of the box as though the wood had remembered him before it was ever cut. Set moved with a speed that stripped away all pretense of celebration. The smile vanished from his face as if it had never existed there. He drove the lid down. The sound it made when it struck was not loud, not compared with thunder or battle, but inside that hall it felt enormous. Final. A hard wooden note that split the evening cleanly in two. The hidden locks engaged. For one frozen instant, no one moved. Minds refuse sudden evil. They try first to interpret it as mischief, mistake, anything but the truth standing plainly in front of them. Then the truth arrived all at once. The sealed chest. Set's face. The armed allies at the edges of the hall stepping forward. The doors closing. Isis moved first. Her chair struck the floor behind her. She crossed half the distance between herself and the chest before Set's confederates intercepted her. Magic flashed from her hands in instinctive, sharp arcs, enough to throw two of them aside. But the room had been prepared. Words of obstruction had been spoken into its corners earlier. Symbols of binding had been hidden beneath carpets and beneath table legs. Set had not merely laid a trap for Osiris. He had arranged resistance for Isis. Then came the sound from inside the chest. Muted. One heavy strike. Then another. Some guests cried out. Some fled toward doors that would not open fast enough. Some stood paralyzed. One or two of the gods looked as if they might intervene, but fear and surprise together are excellent jailers. Set shouted for the chest to be carried. His men seized it. The floor thundered under their steps as they ran. Isis broke free again, this time with a force that cracked the stone beside a column and shattered a row of cups into bright fragments. But the delay, those few impossible heartbeats, had been enough. By the time she reached the outer court, the chest was already being hauled toward the river through torchlit darkness. Set's men loaded the chest onto a boat. Isis ran, sandals slipping in damp silt, linen torn at the hem, hair half loosened from its ordered arrangement. She called Osiris's name once, and the sound carried farther than sound should have carried, over the water, through the reeds, across the sleeping settlements beyond. She tried to summon more complex magic, but anguish is a clumsy instrument. The clean geometries of spellcraft blur when the heart is in pieces. Light gathered in her hands, failed, gathered again. Set himself turned once to look back at her. Not triumphant exactly. Something worse. Relieved. Then the chest was cast into the river. It struck the surface with a hollow, brutal splash and vanished beneath the black water. A second later it rose, rocking, then drifted into the current. The Nile accepted it in silence, as rivers accept everything. Offerings, silt, boats, the dead, crowns, secrets. Isis reached the bank just as the current began drawing it away. She did not stop at the shoreline. She stepped into the water at once, as if determination alone could cancel depth and current. Cold seized her legs. Mud sucked at her feet. She stretched out both arms toward the drifting shape and cried out again. And this time the sound changed the world around her. The air shook. Birds rose from the marsh in a white scattering panic. The water near her feet rippled outward in circles too regular to be natural. Lamps in distant houses flickered. Somewhere a dog began to howl. The grief that tore from her was not merely personal. It was cosmic protest. The widow of Order was calling witness against the first great murder. She fell to her knees in the shallows. The river lapped darkly against her torn garments. Her gold ornaments had half fallen away. Mud stained her hands. Her breath came in broken pulls. Behind her the palace stood lit and immense, and suddenly useless. All its carved certainty, unable to undo one sealed chest, floating toward an unseen horizon. What happened in her then was not simple sorrow. This was transformation. The queen who had spent years weaving harmony into law, ritual, medicine, and field became, in one impossible night, a seeker. Grief stripped her down to purpose. By dawn, rumors were already running through heaven and earth. Osiris was gone. Set had done what no one had imagined could truly be done. The throne was broken. The house of divine order had been violated from within. Death, once a threshold held in proper place, now felt like a weapon loose in the world. And Isis, when the first shock thinned enough for action to return, stood from the mud with river water still dark around her ankles, and made the choice that would define everything that followed. She would find him, not symbolically, not ceremonially, not as comfort to the mourning. She would find the chest, the body, the lost king, wherever river, sea, root, storm, or treachery had taken him. She would walk banks and marshes. She would question gods, children, sailors, and ghosts if she had to. The world had taught her, in one violent lesson, that beauty could be broken. Now she would teach the world something in return. That love with enough knowledge inside it does not end where the river closes. The morning after the river took Osiris, Egypt did not look broken at first. That is one of the cruel habits of the world. Catastrophe happens in a single room, a single river bend, a single chest sinking under stars. And then dawn still arrives, as though punctuality were a virtue greater than mercy. The Nile shone. Birds crossed above the reeds in neat dark strokes. Farmers rose. Water jars were lifted. Bread was kneaded. Smoke climbed from hearths. It all looked offensively normal, but under that ordinary surface, the order of things had shifted. Isis felt it everywhere. In the air, in the pulse beneath stone, in the way prayer sounded thinner, in the slight disobedience of familiar currents. She had spent enough of her life studying hidden correspondences to know when the fabric beneath visible life had been torn. Osiris was not merely missing. The world was now leaning where once it had stood upright. She did not waste time on ceremony. There would be grief enough later. First came the search. The queen disappeared, and the seeker began. She put aside the ornaments of court. Gold catches attention, and attention was now a tax she could not afford. She loosened her hair, wrapped herself in travel-worn linen, took only what she needed: amulets, herbs, instruments of divination, simple food, and the hard, bright purpose that had replaced sleep in her body. If anyone had expected her to collapse into noble sorrow and remain still while others spoke of justice, they learned quickly how little they understood her. She followed the Nile first. Of course she did. Every bend, every inlet, every reach where reeds thickened into green walls and silt softened the banks into dangerous sliding mud. She questioned ferrymen and fishermen. She questioned women washing linen near shallows. She questioned old men repairing nets, boys chasing ibis across wet flats, guards at small shrines, boat makers, potters, anyone who had seen driftwood, a sealed chest, an unusual object moving with the current, a thing too beautiful and too heavy to belong where it passed. Her magic helped, but not always in the ways one might imagine. She could not simply speak a single perfect word and make the chest rise from whatever hidden place now held it. The river is old magic. It keeps what it carries in layers. Current over current. Memory over memory. So she worked through subtler arts. She read disturbances in floating plant patterns. She used polished bowls of water to mirror wider stretches of current. She tracked the movement of birds that circled oddly over certain bends. She cast tiny figures of wax and reed into the stream and watched which direction they turned. Thoth aided her when he could. From him came calculations, flow rates, seasonal pull toward the delta, tide logic once the river's gift passed into the sea, useful things, dry things, perhaps, until one remembers that dry things are often what keep grief from becoming useless. He gave her probabilities, maps, geometric guesses, where an object of that weight and that buoyancy might travel if not sunk, if not shattered, if not taken. Others helped too, though few openly. There were deities who dared offer a word but not yet a public stand. Spirits of place who answered when she poured milk or honey into the roots of sacred trees. Marsh birds that returned to circle over one direction again and again. A child in one village who said she had dreamed of a shining box moving between reeds, while a woman cried from inside the moon. Dreams are messy evidence, but Isis had long since learned not to sneer at messy evidence. Then came the scorpions. They appeared first at twilight. Small, dark bodies moving over cooling stone near the edge of a rest place where Isis had paused to wash mud from her hands. She watched. There were 7 of them at first, then more in later places, arriving as if summoned by the shape of her needed self. They did not threaten her. They formed circles, paths, arrangements too deliberate to be chance. Grief makes allies in unusual corners. These creatures sensed in Isis something they recognized. Perhaps ferocity, perhaps pain, perhaps the hard, bright willingness to strike only when strike one must. They became guards, guides, and at times almost messengers. In rough places they went ahead of her, entering cracks, ruins, root tangles, and abandoned shrines where venomous snakes or hostile spirits might wait. At night they ringed her resting place, the queen of divine magic sleeping on reed mats under the protection of 7 thoroughly ill-tempered little bodyguards. There is dignity in that. Oddly enough, the search widened from river to coast. Reports reached her of strange happenings in foreign lands beyond the mouth of the Nile, of a tree grown impossibly fast, of sweet fragrance in a royal garden, of dreams troubling those who slept near a certain timber pillar. Such stories drifted in bits and scraps through merchants, sailors, and wandering laborers. Each alone might have been nothing. Together they formed a line. Byblos. The name settled into her like a hook, finding cloth. She traveled north by ship for part of the way. Salt gathered on her skin and stiffened her hair. The boards beneath her feet creaked day and night. Nets, tar, rope, old fish, wet wood. All of it created the smell of long passage. She stood at the prow more than she slept, feeling every change in wind. Sometimes she thought she could almost sense Osiris ahead, not as a voice or vision, but as a sorrow growing warmer. When she reached Byblos, she entered not as queen, nor openly as goddess, but hidden. At the heart of the royal precinct stood the tree. Even before she saw it, she knew the air around it held that impossible sweetness, wood and perfume, and a note beneath both that no ordinary plant carries, the trace of enclosed divinity, of sacred presence under bark. It had grown around the chest that held Osiris, taking him into itself and rising vast and beautiful from that secret center. Isis could not simply cut it down and carry the chest away. The tree belonged to the royal household now. It stood in a place watched by many eyes. So she did what she always did best. She changed method. If force was impossible, then infiltration. If command was dangerous, then patience. She entered service in the household, disguised as a foreign woman of remarkable skill and composure. Her beauty she dimmed. Her bearing she lowered into humility. Her speech she tuned carefully to the tone of one who knows much but claims little. Soon enough, as wisdom usually does, she became useful. She healed what other healers had failed to heal. A fever, a swelling, a child's breath gone ragged in the night. Her hands cooled foreheads. Her herbs settled pain. Her words steadied frightened mothers. Usefulness creates trust faster than pedigree. Palace women began seeking her counsel. Servants watched the way animals calmed near her. Even the queen began to notice. The child of the house became the turning point. The infant was sickly, weak in breath, uncertain in sleep, Isis tended him with a gentleness sharpened by all her recent wounds. She fed him, soothed him, and worked subtle healing through touch and whispered rite. Under her care, he improved. Color returned. Breath steadied. The royal mother, grateful and astonished, drew closer. Trust deepened. Then, at last, came the moment when Isis could speak more plainly. Versions of the story differ on how much she revealed at once. Some say she announced herself in unveiled glory. Some say she let truth emerge slowly. However it happened, the result was the same. The Queen of Byblos learned that the strange wise healer in her household was no ordinary woman, and that the marvelous tree at the center of her court enclosed within it the body of a murdered divine king. To her credit, the queen did not refuse. Permission was given. The tree could be opened. Craftsmen were summoned, careful men with quiet hands. They approached the trunk not like woodcutters, but like surgeons. Bark was removed in measured pieces. Fragrant shavings fell. The sweet smell thickened. Layer by layer, they exposed the enclosed form. There, inside the living heart of the tree, rested the chest. When Isis touched it again after so long, her whole body shook. She stood with one palm on the smooth surface, eyes closed, forehead bent slightly toward the wood, and for a moment, the hall around her disappeared. No queen, no servants, no foreign city, only the unbearable fact that she had found him, and that finding is not the same as being restored. The chest was removed with reverence and secrecy. Isis prepared for the return journey, but now caution ruled every step. Set would not leave matters resting forever. If word of her success traveled before she had secured Osiris's body in a hidden place, everything could be lost again. So she chose concealment. Back toward Egypt she went, carrying the chest by discreet routes, river and marsh and side channels, avoiding the main arteries of travel. At last, she selected the deep delta marshes as sanctuary. There, where papyrus grew thick as walls and water wandered through a maze, only reeds and birds understood fully. She hid. It was the right place for secrecy. Mudflats shifted. Channels narrowed or widened with season and flood. Insects hummed at dusk in dense silver clouds. Frogs pulsed from the banks. Water lapped softly against root and reed. The scent was green, wet, fertile, and slightly decaying. Life and dissolution braided together. There she opened the chest. Isis grieved again, but differently now. The first grief had been shock and tearing. This grief had work inside it. She began preservation. She cleaned the body with ritual care, prepared oils and resins, bound what must be bound, spoke over each limb and feature, not merely naming, but reminding. Identity is a form of rescue. She would not let him become anonymous matter. She would not let death persuade the flesh to forget the soul that had once ruled through it. The marsh became workshop, chapel, tomb, and laboratory all at once. Night after night, she worked by lamp and moonlight. The reed walls of her hidden place breathed in the wind. Marsh water clicked softly against roots. Scorpions guarded the edges. Bit by bit, she prepared the impossible, because she was no longer thinking only of burial. She was thinking beyond burial, toward restoration, toward the question no one had yet answered. Can one call life back? But Set was not finished. Word travels in crooked ways. A servant remembers a scent. A watcher notices unusual movement near a side channel. An ally too frightened to remain loyal speaks one name to the wrong ear. However, the information reached him. It reached him enough. Set learned that Isis had recovered Osiris. He learned where, roughly, and the fear that seized him was almost worse than his rage, because now his crime was not secure. He came at night, with storm around him. Wind hit the marsh first, flattening whole fields of papyrus in one direction, then the other. Water rose in chopped dark ridges. Lightning showed the channels in white fragments. The wards Isis had set around her sanctuary flared blue and gold as the pressure of his approach struck them. Reed walls hissed. Scorpions raised their tails and scattered outward toward the edges. Then he was there. The fight that followed was chaos against precision, brute force against exactitude. Set tore at the protective boundaries with storms and impact. Isis answered with layered barriers, fields of redirection, spells cast not to dazzle, but to survive. Water leaped under the violence of it. Reed islands broke apart. Birds erupted into the night. More than once she nearly held him off. He reached the body. What happened next belongs to the darkest heart of the story. He did not merely try to destroy Osiris. Instead, he dismembered him, cutting the body into separate pieces and scattering them across Egypt so that no restoration could easily follow. It was not only violence, it was strategy, a geography of despair. Each piece went to a different place. Desert, river, grove, shrine, hidden bank, inaccessible marsh, distant edge of cultivated land. The body of the king was turned into a map of grief. When Set was done, the sanctuary was ruined. The storm rolled onward, and Isis, left amid broken reeds, mud, extinguished lamps, and the terrible absence of wholeness, understood that her task had not ended in Byblos. It had begun again, larger and crueler than before. She would have to search once more, not for one chest now, but for a scattered husband, for hands, for feet, for heart, for fragments of kingship hidden in mud and root and stone. The world had not merely taken Osiris. It had been instructed to hide him, and still, after all this, she did not yield. That is the true center of Isis. Not beauty, not power, not even magic, though she has more of it than any. It is the refusal to stop loving once love has become labor beyond reason. So, before the next dawn fully opened over the marsh, she gathered what could be gathered, wrapped what could be wrapped, steadied her breath, and turned herself toward the long second quest. Because the body of Osiris was now somewhere in pieces beneath the wide Egyptian sky, and Isis intended, piece by sacred piece, to bring him home. Some griefs make a person smaller. Some turn the soul into a road. Isis stepped into the second kind. The marsh where Set had shattered her hope still trembled with the aftertaste of storm. Broken reeds leaned into black water. Mud held the deep prints of divine struggle. The lamps she had lit for healing lay drowned and cold. For a little while she stood among the wreckage and listened, not with the ears alone, but with that inward sense she had sharpened across years of study and sorrow. Somewhere beyond the reeds and the channels and the sleeping villages, the scattered pieces of Osiris still existed. Hidden, buried, guarded, swallowed by distance and cruelty, but existing. That mattered. Existence meant possibility. So she began again. This time she did not move as a queen, nor even simply as a widow. She moved like a cartographer of absence. She mapped what was missing. She knelt in the mud and touched the place where each violation had occurred, reading the faint residue of Set's power the way a scribe reads indentations in wet clay. Every act leaves shape behind. Every motion of rage has an angle, a rhythm, a direction. Set had not scattered the body at random. He had chosen with purpose, and purpose can be followed. Isis prepared a new vessel for the search, a papyrus boat woven by her own hands, though woven is too simple a word for what she made. Each reed was selected under a particular moon. Each cord was knotted to numerical ratios she knew would steady the flow of magic. She whispered protection into the hull and concealment into the seams. Along the prow she traced signs of return. Along the stern she traced signs of endurance. The little craft smelled of green river growth, wet fiber, and resin. It looked humble. That pleased her. Humble things pass unnoticed. Her boat slipped through channels so narrow that papyrus brushed her shoulders as she passed. Dragonflies flickered over the water. Somewhere beyond the reeds, a heron gave one sharp call and then fell still. Isis felt the pull before she saw the place. A backwater choked with silt, half hidden beneath drifting plants. She stepped down into knee-deep water. The spell she used was not dramatic. No lightning, only a slow drawing upward, as if memory itself were lifting. Mud loosened. Water clouded. Then the first sacred fragment rose from the dark below. She took it into her arms with the care of a mother lifting a feverish child. That was how the whole quest would be. Not triumphant. Intimate. Each recovery demanded something different. Some pieces had been hidden in desert margins, where the wind erased tracks as soon as they were made. There the sun pressed down like a judgment, and the horizon trembled in white heat. Sand hissed over stone. Isis wrapped her head in linen and moved over the barren land with patient steps, guided by charms that tasted the air for lingering threads of Osiris's essence. The desert was Set's language, dry, severe, deceptive. Distances lied. Shapes shifted. Once she walked for hours toward what seemed to be a grove and found only stone that reflected the sky. Another time, a hollow in the ground turned out to be guarded by serpents whose eyes shone with borrowed malice. She did not waste rage on them. A word, a gesture, a fold in the air, and they slept. Other pieces had been hidden in places dense with life. Groves, where root tangled over root and damp earth, smelled rich enough to swallow footprints whole. Banks, where the river undercut the soil so badly that every step threatened collapse. Ruins where old shrines leaned at odd angles and bats stirred above broken ceilings. In one such place, children saw her pass and later swore that a woman in travel-stained linen had spoken kindly to a fig tree, and the fig tree had answered by dropping ripe fruit into her hands. I rather like that story. It sounds like something the world would do for her by then. The scorpions came and went as guardians, scouts, and silent witnesses. At night they ringed her resting place in a dark crescent. By day they vanished into cracks and roots, only to reappear where danger waited. Once one climbed onto her wrist and tapped there until she woke, moments before a section of ruined stone collapsed nearby. Months stretched. There was no single grand surge of success, only repetition. Search, recover, cleanse, wrap, protect, continue. At dawn, she washed her face in river water and spoke the names of the missing pieces. At noon, she checked the bindings around those she had already recovered. At dusk, she listened to birds, insects, froze, wind, because by then, she had learned that all of nature changes tone around hidden divinity. She found the hands apart from one another, which would have hurt her more than she expected. Those hands had carried crook and flail, had blessed fields, had rested against her shoulders in the calmer years before betrayal. She held each one and remembered not power first, but warmth. That is the sly thing about love. It reduces the grand to the personal. A king becomes the man who once brushed dust from your sleeve. She found part of the torso in a place where reeds bent constantly, though there was no wind. She found a foot caught beneath roots thick as braided ropes. She found the heart after a search so difficult that even she nearly broke under it. Set had worked dark alterations upon it, trying to confuse its true resonance. The chamber where she recovered it was low and damp and smelled of minerals, stagnant water, and old malice. When at last she held it, she did not speak. She simply bowed her head and wept quietly for a few breaths, because some victories are too exhausted for ceremony. Piece by piece, she restored what could be restored to wholeness of form. Her camp became a hidden anatomy of devotion. Wrapped fragments lay in carefully prepared spaces, each accompanied by the proper herbs, resines, formulas, protective seals, and whispered remembrances. There is something almost unbearable in the image of a goddess making order out of desecration with her own hands, and yet there is comfort in it too. The broken thing is not abandoned. It is tended. At last, only one part remained forever lost. The sacred fish of the Nile had consumed the phallus before Set could hide it elsewhere. The river kept that secret in its own dark way. Isis searched. Of course she did. She questioned fishermen, cast divinations into the water, followed contradictory signs. For a while, she hoped that perhaps some fragment of the divine substance might still be reclaimed. But the truth settled over her slowly, and then all at once. That part of Osiris was gone beyond retrieval. It is one of the most sorrowful and strangely human moments in the whole myth. After crossing deserts and marshes and ruined shrines, after proving that love could outwalk malice, she reached the one limit that effort alone could not overturn. So she did what only Isis would do. She invented the answer. The making of the replacement was craft, magic, prayer, mathematics, longing, memory. She selected sacred cedar for the core because it held shape and scent and was beloved by temple builders. She covered it in wax made pure through repeated melting and blessing. Into its forming she worked proportions drawn from the hidden patterns she had long studied in stars. Seeds, shells, petals, flood cycles, all the repeating measures through which life whispers its architecture. Nothing accidental. Every curve, every line, every polished surface had intention inside it. The ritual by which she animated the crafted form required a chamber prepared with impossible precision. She chose a place deep in the marshes and lined it with inscriptions that operated as channels for power. Lamps burned aromatic oil. Bowls of natron stood at each corner. At the chamber's center lay Osiris, reassembled as fully as devotion and magic had allowed. Mummification became in her hands not the preserving of death, but the preparation of return. She worked over him for days that blurred into nights, and then into something beyond both. Resin warmed over low flame. Linen strips softened in sacred oils. Natron drew away corruption. Prayers were spoken at the exact moment. Stars crossed certain invisible thresholds overhead. She wrapped not only flesh, but function, sealing intention back into form. Over the eyes, words for vision. Over the mouth, words for command. Over the chest, words for remembrance. Over the feet, words for passage. Each layer turned body into instrument. When all was ready, Isis entered the deepest phase of the work. She sat beside Osiris until her breathing matched the rhythm she wanted life to remember. She lowered herself into trance so far that the ordinary edges of the world thinned. Water sounds grew distant. Lamp flames lengthened into gold threads. The chamber walls no longer felt like walls, but membranes between states of being. In that condition, she could perceive what most cannot: the subtle lines connecting matter to essence, the pathways by which consciousness leaves, the possible, fragile routes by which it might return. No one had done this before. There was no manual. She was alone with genius, love, and terror. She called him, not loudly, not as one calls across a room. She called across condition, across the great division. She used names older than titles, names woven of private memory and cosmic function, both. She reminded him of the first mornings of their reign, of the grain-bending gold under sunlight, of the cool stone floors of temple halls before dawn, of the way justice felt when it was actually practiced and not merely promised. She called the king, the husband, the green renewing force, the beloved. Something changed. The air in the chamber thickened. Lamp flames bent inward, though there was no wind. The water in the bowls shivered. For one impossibly stretched instant, Isis felt nothing and thought perhaps she had failed. And then the entire room gave a quiet answering pulse, as if some great hidden heart had struck once beneath the earth. Osiris returned, not fully to ordinary life, but consciousness came back into the prepared body. The eyes opened. The gaze found hers. He was liminal then, between worlds, not restored to earthly kingship, not yet lord of the realm beyond, but awake, present. His speech was thin at first, more thought than voice, his movements slight, yet he knew her. That alone would have been enough to justify every mile she had walked. But Isis had not brought him back only to speak farewell. The line of kingship had to continue. Set had meant to end more than a life. He had meant to end legitimacy, to cut succession itself. What followed between Isis and the restored Osiris exists in the strange, luminous territory where theology, longing, and miracle meet. The union was made possible by all her previous labor, by the replacement she had crafted, by the life force she lent him, by the chamber prepared between worlds. It was brief, sacred, and unlike any other joining in the memory of gods. From that union, Horus was conceived, a child formed from lawful kingship, broken death, fierce magic, impossible persistence. A child who belonged to the future, but was made from everything the past had tried to bury. Afterward, Osiris's restored awareness could not remain in the world of the living. His destiny had changed. What Isis had won was not permanent earthly return, but something equally immense. She had given him the passage to become ruler of the dead, judge beyond the veil, king in the hidden western lands where souls go to be weighed and known. Death would not erase him. It would become his kingdom. Their final time together in that marsh chamber was soft rather than grand. No storm, no chorus of gods, just the low fragrance of resin, dim lamps, the hush of reeds outside, and the unbearable gentleness of two beings who had lost everything ordinary and still found one another at the edge of endings. He thanked her, though the word feels far too small. She touched his face as if memorizing it again. He told her what must come next, that the child must live, that Set would hunt what remained of justice in the world, that she must become shield, teacher, and hidden fire. Then he was gone from the realm of breathing things. Not lost, never again entirely lost, but gone where she could not easily follow. And Isis, carrying within herself the newly kindled life of Horus, understood that the quest had changed shape once more. She had gathered the pieces. She had defeated the first victory of death. She had made the future possible. Now she would have to protect it. Outside, dawn was just beginning to thin the darkness over the marshes. Mist lay low over the channels. Birds started testing the morning with uncertain notes. The world looked almost innocent again, which by now Isis knew never to trust completely. She extinguished the ritual lamps one by one, wrapped the chamber in concealment, gathered what knowledge had been born there. Then she laid a hand over her still flat abdomen and felt, not movement yet, but promise. Set had shattered a body and hoped to shatter a line. Instead, in a hidden chamber smelling of cedar, wax, and river air, Isis had answered him with an air. Pregnancy changed the shape of every fear. Until then, Isis had been searching outward. Now the sacred future traveled inside her, and danger became intimate. Set was no longer merely the murderer of her husband or the thief of a throne. He would destroy a child if given the chance. She withdrew into the delta. The marshlands of the Nile are beautiful in a way that would annoy a poet, because they make beauty look effortless. Reeds rise in dense green crowds. Water opens suddenly between them like polished stone. Mud smells of growth and age together. Sunlight pools on the channels by day, and at dusk, everything turns silver and blue. For someone trying not to be found, it was perfect. Isis chose an island so hidden that even local fishermen rarely passed near it, the channels approaching it twisted in confusing lines. Banks looked the same from every angle. Tall papyrus broke sight into 1,000 shifting screens. She wove her shelter from the marsh itself. Papyrus stems bent, tied, layered, sealed. Mud plaster smoothed gaps. Reeds became roof. Root and woven mat became floor. From a distance, it was only one more tangle of growth, no more noticeable than a bird nest or a patch of sedge. Inside, it was neat, spare, and watchful. Then she covered it in magic. The first layer made the island difficult to remember. Travelers who drifted too near would blink, turn their boat half a degree, and afterward feel certain there had been nothing there worth noticing. The second layer misled direction. One path became 3. The third layer was protection outright. If anything came with hostile intent, the reeds would whisper, the water would tighten, the air itself would resist entry. The scorpions stayed. By then, they were less companions than a small militant nation sworn to her cause. They patrolled the island at night, in crisp, dark lines. The largest positioned itself near the entrance of her shelter, as though it had appointed itself captain of the guard. I suspect it had. When danger brushed the outer wards, their tails rose in unison like a field of hooked black thorns. It was a wonderfully serious level of commitment from creatures most people would rather not find in their sandals. Her pregnancy was not gentle. How could it be? Horus was no ordinary child. He had been conceived in the narrow passage between death and life, under star-bound rites, through love sharpened by catastrophe. The power growing within her pressed against the ordinary limits of gestation. At times, she felt not merely movement, but flashes of force. A pulse that made the oil lamps bend toward her. A sudden warmth in her hands when she touched water. Once, when she woke from an uneasy sleep, the reeds outside her shelter had flowered overnight, in full, impossible bloom. She kept careful notes. Which herbs settled the surges of divine heat? Which moon phases made the child quieter? Which songs soothed the strange tension under her ribs when the little god inside her seemed to dream of hawks and open sky? Grinding roots, measuring oil, checking ward lines, listening to frogs, carrying the fate of kingship while trying not to slip on wet mud. Loneliness visited often. No court, no companion, only marsh sounds and the awareness of being hunted. At times she sat at the doorway after sunset and spoke softly to Osiris, telling him how the child grew and how tired she was, because she was building a dynasty in a swamp. When labor came, it came under favorable stars because Isis, even in pain, still preferred good planning. The night was warm. Constellations hung clear above the marsh, The water around the island reflected strips of heaven between the reed shadows. She had prepared for this. Clean linens, bowls of water, oils, protective amulets, knives purified in smoke, incantations inscribed where her eyes could find them, even through exhaustion. Yet no amount of preparation makes birth small. It remains what it is, a crossing. The island reacted as the child approached the world. Reeds shivered, though no wind passed through them. Water in the bowls brightened faintly. The scorpions massed around the shelter in absolute silence. Their stillness was almost ceremonial. Isis worked through the pain the way she had worked through everything, with intelligence, endurance, and an astonishing refusal to surrender dignity, even when dignity had become deeply inconvenient. Then Horus was born. He came into the world fierce with life. The marsh seemed to know it. Light moved strangely over the channels. The papyrus walls glowed softly from within, as if dawn had gotten lost and arrived hours too early. The child's skin held a subtle radiance. His eyes, when they opened, were far too aware for a newborn. Not adult awareness. No. Something different. A bright, clear animal divinity, like a hawk understanding height before it understands rest. Isis held him, and for the first time in a very long time, allowed herself a kind of joy not immediately followed by strategy. Just for a few breaths, just the warmth of him against her chest, the small, astonishing weight, the smell of milk and river and new skin. She kissed his brow and told him his name. Horus. The sound settled into the little shelter like a vow. But joy in that season had to live beside vigilance. The child grew quickly. Too quickly by mortal standards. His dreams were not infant dreams. While he slept, small things happened. Feathers would appear on the floor, not fallen from any real bird. The surface of water would ripple as if something winged had just passed over it. Once, during an afternoon nap, a tiny arc of light ran from his fingertips to the doorframe and left a mark like a painted eye. Isis watched all this with equal parts pride and concern. Power in a hidden child is wonderful in theory. In practice, it leaks. So she taught protection almost from the cradle. Amulets were sewn into his wrappings. Protective symbols painted near the threshold. Songs layered with spells. She transformed herself at times into a kite and circled above the island, appearing no more suspicious than any other marsh bird while keeping watch over every approach. At other times, she rooted herself as a sycamore at the channel edge, listening through bark and water vibration for distant intrusions. Every form offered a different kind of sight. The first great terror of Horus's infancy came when Isis left the shelter only briefly to gather herbs. The child was asleep. The wards were stable. Yet danger does not need long. It only needs a gap. When she returned, the island felt wrong before she even crossed the final reeds. Mothers know this. The air had a strained stillness, the kind that exists after a cry has stopped too suddenly. She dropped the herbs at once and entered the shelter. Horus lay pale and strangely quiet. Near his small body she saw the mark. Venom, not from an ordinary creature either, but from something drawn or sent by malice and sharpened by supernatural intention. Her vision narrowed. For an instant, all the magnificent disciplines of Isis, healer, magician, strategist, collapsed into the most primitive and terrible sentence a mother can feel. Not my child. Then action returned. She lifted him, called his name, felt how cold he had become. She searched the wound with fingers that did not tremble, only because terror had gone beyond trembling. The poison was moving fast. She could feel it not only in his flesh, but in the disruption of his divine pattern, a stain trying to move through light itself. There was no time for elegant healing. She had to build a cure in motion. She laid him across her lap and began the work. Words first. Not loud. Precise. She named the venom. Named the pathway it had taken. Named the authority by which it would be denied. Then breath, passing over the wound in measured cycles. Then touch, drawing the poison's heat toward herself without letting it root. Lamps flared. Outside, the scorpions clattered in furious circles. Isis felt the venom move through her awareness as if she had invited it into her own veins. And still she kept going. She called on every healing principle she had ever mastered. Harmony restored. Corruption named and expelled. Divine structure remembered. She pressed her forehead to Horus's and poured life force through the contact until the edges of her own vision darkened. For a while, nothing changed, and that was the worst moment, the stretch in which effort seems to strike a locked door. Then warmth returned. Slightly, then more. His breath caught, shuddered, continued. Color rose in the smallest amount under the luminous skin. Isis nearly collapsed with relief. But she still had work to finish. She sealed the wound, neutralized the last residue, marked him with new protections. Only when she was certain the danger had passed did she allow herself to bend over him and shake with the aftershock. That near loss changed her methods. She created stronger amulets after that, ones designed specifically against poison, hidden malice, and supernatural intrusion. She suspended them above his sleeping place and bound smaller ones into his clothing. She revised the wards, added layers that distinguished between ordinary marsh life and entities driven by hostile purpose. If a venomous thing entered the perimeter now, the water itself would answer. She did not trust chance again. Set's attacks did not stop. They adapted. Serpents came one season, sliding through channels before dawn, unnaturally silent, scales dark as burnt copper. The scorpions met them at the shallows in ugly, determined combat, while Isis held Horus behind a shield of hard blue light. She burned them from the air with a sound-based spell that made the whole island ring. Corrupted creatures came too, things that looked almost natural until they moved wrong. Set had discovered that fear works better when it nearly resembles the world one trusts. The first wave of attacks came through serpents whose venom had been enhanced through dark magical processes. They arrived before dawn, slithering through the channels with movements so subtle they barely disturbed the water. The lead serpent was enormous, its eyes glowing with inner fire, and its movement so smooth it left almost no wake. The second wave came within days and employed corrupted scorpions. A cruel choice, because kinship became confusion. Isis recognized them by their deep crimson shells and their wrong, erratic movement. The third major assault employed flying creatures that could bypass the ground-based defenses. These were supernatural wasps, large as small birds, metallic, venomous, and horribly fast. Through all this, Horus grew. His childhood was not ordinary, though pieces of ordinary life clung to it bravely. Isis still fed him, washed him, sung to him at evening, scolded him when curiosity pulled him too close to the water's edge. But alongside these things, she trained him. First, in awareness, to notice wind shifts, bird silences, the difference between a natural track in wet soil and one pressed there by intent. Later, in concealment, how to still his glow, how to quiet the flare of instinctive power. Then in memory, the names of his father, the story of lawful rule, the difference between strength and cruelty. He learned quickly. Too quickly, perhaps, but danger is an efficient tutor. Sometimes he practiced in falcon form, still young and awkward at first, then increasingly magnificent. He would rise over the marsh on broad, uncertain wings, circle, dip, return to a post with bright, fierce satisfaction. Isis watched every flight with pride sharpened by dread. Height belonged to him naturally. So did kingship. The world would see both soon enough. Her task was to make sure he lived long enough for that day. As he entered boyhood, the questions grew harder. Why are we hidden? Why does Set hunt us? Why can I not stand openly where I belong? Isis answered carefully, never lying, never giving bitterness more room than truth required. She told him of Osiris, of betrayal, of the long labor by which he had come into being. She told him that rightful things are sometimes driven into shadow before they return. She told him that power without wisdom is merely another form of storm. He listened. You can almost feel the shape of the future forming in those conversations. The child not merely learning revenge, but inheritance. Set's rule beyond the marsh darkened meanwhile. News drifted in through merchants, peasants, hidden sympathizers, and the old channels by which truth survives despite tyranny. Crops mismanaged, fear cultivated, justice bent, temples watched, loyalists rewarded, honest voices punished. Horus absorbed these reports with a stillness that reminded Isis more and more of Osiris. It was a painful comfort. There were moments of softness, too. Even hunted childhood leaves room for wonder. Horus chased dragonflies, asked impossible questions about stars, fell asleep once with one hand tangled in his mother's linen and his other resting on the back of the largest scorpion as if it were a household pet. He laughed when ibis stole fish from one another. He learned the smell of rain before it came. He learned which reeds made the best whistles. These details matter. They keep myth from becoming marble. Before he was avenger and claimant and falcon king, he was simply a child in the marsh, being loved past all reasonable measure. By the time his limbs lengthened and his powers steadied into something more disciplined, Isis knew concealment could not last forever. The island that had once been cradle and fortress had become a waiting room, Horus was no longer something to hide only. He was something the world would have to reckon with. Still, before courts and contests, before law and combat, before the long reckoning with Set, there remained this final chapter of hidden growth. A mother in the reeds. A boy destined for the throne. Scorpions on patrol. Water whispering under moonlight. Lessons spoken quietly over bowls of fish and bread. The whole future of divine kingship being raised in a place most people would dismiss as mud and insects. Greatness rarely begins where greatness expects to begin. Sometimes it begins in a palace, sometimes in a temple, and sometimes it begins in a hut of woven papyrus deep in the marsh, where a mother refuses to let terror have the final word. Hey there, settle in close, because the hidden child in the reeds is not hidden any longer, and the quiet water that kept him safe is about to give him back to the world. By now, the marsh has done its work. It has fed him, covered him, cooled his anger when it grew too hot, and taught his eyes to read the slightest tremor on the skin of the river. But safety is a season, not a kingdom. And beyond the reeds, Set still sits where he should never have sat, wearing rule like a stolen robe that almost fits until the light catches the seams. Horus grew into height and force the way a storm front gathers over a flat horizon, slowly enough that the eye can deny it at first, then all at once, so that one morning the whole sky has changed. His shoulders broadened, his voice deepened. The boy who once slept with a hand curled near his cheek began waking before dawn to train while the mist still clung low over the channels. Isis watched him move through forms she had taught him, the disciplined turn of the body, the timing of breath, the exact angle at which power should be released and not wasted. She taught him how to fight, yes, but more than that, she taught him how not to become the thing he fought. That lesson mattered. Set ruled now by making fear look practical. Under him, strength had become a blunt object. Order had become surveillance. Temples that had once opened their courts to healing and study narrowed into places of obedience. Priests who had served balance learned to serve whichever direction the storm happened to be blowing. Grain moved, but not kindly. Law remained, but it leaned. Rewards flowed upward. Punishment flowed down. The old music of just rule, that steady music Osiris had once carried through the land, had been replaced by a harsher sound. Sandals in corridors at the wrong hour, doors closing too quickly, voices lowering when officials passed. News reached the marsh in fragments, carried by fishermen, traders, women filling jars at the water edge, men who had learned to speak one truth with their mouths and another with their eyes. Isis taught Horus to listen to these reports without swallowing them whole. One story alone is weather. 10 stories telling the same thing are climate. He learned the pattern. Set's court had become a place where flatterers bloomed like mold in shade. Judges bent rulings toward whoever stood closest to power. Tax collectors were never hungry. Farmers often were. Small cruelties multiplied, because small cruelties are how great tyrannies save their strength. Horus absorbed these things with a stillness that reminded Isis of Osiris so sharply it hurt. Yet there was another current in him too. Bright, direct, dangerous if not governed. He was the son of resurrection and grievance. He had been made for reply. In training, he could move faster than most grown gods could track. In falcon form, he cut through the air with such clean command that even the marsh birds lifted away when he passed. His sight reached far. His reflexes were terrible and beautiful. Once, during practice, he split a reed spear into 2 equal lengths, with a strike delivered almost lazily, as if his body had solved the problem before thought arrived. Isis saw the power and did not smile. Power alone had already done enough damage in their family. So she widened his education. She taught him law by lamplight, tracing precedents in dust and clay. She taught him names of ancestors and the shape of rightful inheritance. She taught him how words in a hall can strike farther than spears on a field. Sometimes he grew impatient. This too was natural. Young strength imagines justice as impact. Isis knew better. Justice is often endurance wearing the clothes of patience until the proper hour arrives. Even so, the hour did begin to draw near. As Horus entered full youth, signs followed him. Birds gathered where he stood. Light lingered on his skin after sunset. In dreams, he saw a throne room he had never walked in waking life. Columns, banners, polished stone, the fixed gaze of old gods pretending neutrality while fear pricked under their gold. He described these visions to Isis, and she did not dismiss them. Some callings come like a trumpet. Some come like repetition. The same chamber in dream after dream is not fancy. It is invitation. Set also sensed the shift. He had failed to kill the child in infancy. Failed again through venom, claw, wing, and paid malice. Now rumors reached him of a young falcon lord moving in hidden territories, of certain old loyalties quietly reappearing, of temple servants keeping one extra lamp lit in corners not assigned to any living ruler. Tyrants are like old dogs around thunder. They hear what others deny. Set began tightening his hold. More watchers, more oaths, more displays of force. His mistake was the oldest one. When fear begins to leak, he squeezed harder, and in squeezing harder, he taught everyone exactly what they were living under. At last, Isis judged that concealment was no longer protection. It had become postponement. The decision was made in evening quiet. Water touched the reeds with soft, repetitive sounds. A cooking flame moved low in the hut. Horus sat opposite his mother, now so grown that in the dimness, his profile, sometimes briefly, became his father's and then shifted back. Isis laid before him the old case in plain form. Osiris had been murdered. Set had usurped. The line of kingship had not ended. By law, by blood, by cosmic order, the claim was his. Yet a throne seized through violence cannot always be taken back through violence without making that violence the new standard. There would be challenge. There would be tribunal. There would be danger in the open and insult dressed as procedure. Horus listened, and when she finished, he did not answer quickly. That pleased her more than any bold vow could have done. When he finally spoke, his voice carried both youth and gravity. He said he did not want the throne only because it was his. He wanted it because the land had grown crooked beneath Set. That was the right answer, and also a dangerous one, because righteous men can become severe when convinced they serve righteousness. Isis noted the fire in him and decided to keep speaking until the fire learned a hearth. Preparation began at once. They left the deepest marsh at dawn in a boat that had once carried secrecy and now carried intention. The scorpions remained on the banks, arranged in a dark crescent, as if seeing off a prince. The river broadened. Villages appeared. Fields opened. Horus saw more clearly than ever what Set's years had done. Irrigation channels neglected at the edges. Storehouses guarded too heavily. Faces trained to unreadability. A child who laughed until an official turned his head, then fell silent, as if laughter itself required permission. These were not spectacular miseries. That was what made them persuasive. A kingdom is rarely broken by one dramatic blow. It is more often bent a finger width at a time until everyone forgets straightness. Word preceded them. It always does. By the time Isis and Horus approached the places where divine hearings were customarily called, the air already felt altered. Supporters of old order emerged carefully, not with banners first, but with practical assistance. A place to rest. A sealed jar of oil. Witnesses willing to travel. Records long kept hidden in storage chambers. A priest with a memory for genealogies. A scribe with copies of older rulings. Justice, when starved long enough, becomes very skilled at living on scraps until fed again. Set responded exactly as Isis expected. He did not refuse the hearing outright. That would have admitted too much. Instead, he agreed with great public dignity, the manner of a ruler so secure he could afford process. He called for formal proceedings before the divine tribunal, the great assembly whose authority even tyrants prefer to borrow rather than openly deny. It was a clever move. In halls like that, delay can be weapon, confusion can be weapon, performance can be weapon. Set trusted those instruments because he had used them for years. Horus entered in white linen and gold restraint. He did not dress like a fugitive made sudden prince. He dressed like continuity. Isis walked beside him, calm as moonlight on a blade. Murmurs moved through the chamber like wind through dry leaves. Set arrived later, because men who rule through pressure mistake delay for majesty. He came, surrounded by authority, red-edged, polished, heavy. He looked magnificent in the way a sandstorm can look magnificent when seen from far enough away. Then Isis rose. There are moments in stories where speech changes weather. This was one. She did not shout. She did not plead. She laid the matter down in order. Osiris had ruled by right. Osiris had been killed not by lawful contest, nor by natural passing, but by treachery. Treachery does not become legitimacy because it survives long enough to decorate itself. The line had continued. Horus had been conceived lawfully, hidden lawfully, preserved lawfully against unlawful violence. Therefore the claim stood. Each sentence fell cleanly. No wasted ornament. She gave the judges nothing to hide behind except their own consciences. Witnesses followed. Some had been present at the fatal banquet. Some had seen the chest carried away. Some knew of the long persecution that came after. Others spoke to Set's rule in practical detail. Corruption, coercion, the quiet thefts that never make epics, but always make widows. Documents were read. Genealogies recited. Magical residues demonstrated through rites only a master could perform safely in open court. Isis recreated traces of Set's violence so the judges could feel, not merely hear of, the pattern of his act. No forged account could carry that texture. Guilt has a signature. Set's advocates attempted every familiar tactic. Delay. Distraction. Questions meant not to reveal truth, but to fray composure. Why had formal challenge taken so long? Why should hidden years not count as forfeiture? Could grief have distorted memory? Could magic not simulate anything? It was legal argument, at its most scented and well-dressed. Isis answered with patience so exact, it became its own form of humiliation. Delay had been survival. Concealment had protected the rightful heir from continued murder attempts. Memory corroborated by multiple witnesses and divine trace was not fantasy. And if magic can counterfeit some things, she noted, it cannot counterfeit bloodline before the eyes of those fit to judge it. Horus also spoke, and his words mattered because they revealed what kind of ruler he might become. He did not boast of strength, though everyone present could see it in him. He did not promise vengeance without limit. He spoke of restoration, of balance returned, of law made trustworthy again, of temples reopened to learning and healing, of grain stored for use and not for leverage. Some in the chamber looked moved. Others looked frightened, because a just future is terribly inconvenient to those who have grown comfortable in a crooked present. The first challenge was balance under force. Control the storm. Protect the vulnerable. A problem made to reveal not only power, but preference. Set answered as Set always did, with grandeur and force, with skies darkened and wind driven hard, with command that inspired awe and collateral damage alike. Horus met the same test differently. He did not dominate the storm so much as redirect its anger. Shield here, open there, break force into channels. Save the low fields first, then the villages, then the sacred groves. Watching him, Isis felt the old ache of hope, that most painful of returning things. The second challenge was judgment, legal and moral knots posed before the assembly. Cases of inheritance, border conflict, injury, intention, hunger, and theft. Set saw each as an opportunity to reinforce authority. Preserve authority. Punish quickly. Make examples. Horus saw relation, cause and effect, future harm, repair. You could feel the judges shifting by then. Many had expected hot blood from the son of murdered Osiris. Instead, they found thought. The final tests would come later. The hall had not finished with them. But as the first day closed and the torches lowered, a subtle change had entered the chamber. Set was still dangerous, still enthroned, still thick with power. Yet for the first time, his possession of the future looked uncertain. That uncertainty was enough to make the whole room breathe differently. The night before the decisive reckonings, mother and son stood together between torchlight and darkness, between the hidden marsh that had raised him and the public world now demanding to measure him. Behind them lay years of concealment, poison, prayer, and training. Ahead waited combat, verdict, and the shape of a kingdom not yet restored. And in the quiet between those two worlds, Isis understood that all her grief had changed form once more. It was no longer only grief. It had become witness. It had become strategy. It had become a young god, standing straight beneath a stolen roof, preparing to ask the universe to remember what belonged where. The last trials were the kind that reveal the soul by pretending to test only the hand. When morning entered the tribunal hall, it came in long, pale bands through the high stone openings, laying light across the floor in rectangles that seemed almost too calm for what the day would hold. Judges took their places again. Scribes wetted reed pens. Attendants refreshed incense. Set arrived with the same polished certainty as before, though certainty has a smell when it begins to sour, and by then the whole chamber carried the faint, dry scent of it. The tribunal announced that the remaining contests would determine not only who could claim power, but who could bear its consequences. That distinction mattered to Isis. Any brute can seize. Bearing is harder. Bearing means living under what one decides. He opened with force. Red storm energy gathered around him in harsh spirals. Sand seemed to appear where no sand lay, a dry, grinding illusion made briefly real by wrath. His style was magnificence weaponized. Strike hard enough, and even truth flinches. He came at Horus with speed no mortal eye could have followed clearly. Blows meant to end rather than educate. Horus met him not with lesser strength, but with cleaner strength. He shifted, turned, redirected. Used angles Set despised, because angles require patience. Again and again Set drove power like a hammer. And again, Horus answered like a falcon moving through crosswind, never wasting height, never losing the line of return. At one point, Set managed to force him back almost to the edge of the ward circle. The judges leaned forward. The hall tightened. Horus slipped into falcon form in a blur of gold and white, rose just above the reach of a killing blow, then descended with such exact velocity that one of Set's ceremonial weapons flew from his grasp and skidded, ringing across the floor. The sound it made when it stopped was small, almost comic. It was, frankly, a rather satisfying little sound. Set roared and abandoned the pretense of measured contest. His attacks grew heavier, less disciplined. Columns of force, splintering pressure, heat, dry wind. Everything about him said that if he could not impress the tribunal, he would simply overwhelm it. That was always the danger. Tyrants agree to rules only, while rules look like secret servants. Horus saw it too. Instead of answering with equivalent fury, he did something more devastating. He maintained control. He kept the fight within bounds. He showed the court that one claimant was wrestling with rage, and the other was governing it. This mattered more than any strike. Still, the battle was not clean. Set wounded him. A slash across the arm. A blow to the ribs. A surge of force that left the taste of metal in the air and sent Horus to one knee for the space of 2 breaths. Isis did not move. She could not. Her stillness during that moment was one of the greatest acts of power in the room. To remain seated while your child bleeds before your enemy is a discipline no temple trains for. Horus rose. He finished the contest not by crushing Set, though perhaps he could have tried, but by placing him in a position where any further escalation would clearly violate the tribunal's order. It was a political victory wrapped in martial form. The judges saw it. More importantly, everyone else saw that the son of Osiris had the one quality Set could never counterfeit: force held in service to something higher than appetite. The later tests pressed on wisdom and kingship. Difficult disputes were laid before them. Border quarrels, famine, distribution, a theft committed from hunger, a priest who lied for peace, a governor who kept the law and broke the people. Set answered according to dominance. Preserve authority. Punish quickly. Make examples. Horus answered according to order that could survive itself. Restore where possible. Distinguish need from greed. Judge intention, damage, and future consequence together. Let law remain strong enough to trust and gentle enough to be obeyed without hatred. Then came what many remembered longest, the test of seeing. Not eyesight, perception. The tribunal concealed truths within layered appearances and asked each claimant to identify what truly threatened the kingdom. Set named enemies he already knew how to hate. Outsiders, critics, rivals. Horus named corruption hidden inside administration, fear disguised as respect, and the exhaustion of people who stop believing justice can hear them. You could feel the hall change around those words. Some judges looked down. A few attendants looked very still. Isis watched the sentence travel through the room like a lamp being uncovered. Once the contests ended, the tribunal withdrew. Deliberation is often theater, but in this case, it was also fear doing arithmetic. Set still held real power. Armies, officers, loyalties bought over years. Yet the judges had now seen too much to unknow it. Murder, usurpation, tyranny, and the clear presence of a lawful heir who had proved blood, strength, intelligence, and restraint. Their delay stretched. Hours passed. Light shifted. Servants brought water. No one drank much. During that waiting, Isis sat with her hands folded and let memory move through her in slow, silent waves. She remembered the first brilliance of her own youth, the sense that reality was a language she might one day read fluently. She remembered Osiris in green regalia, smiling as if justice were a natural weather system and not a thing constantly requiring repair. She remembered the chest, the river, the first quest, the second, the wrapped pieces, the cedar, the beeswax, the chamber, the half-returned gaze of a husband between life and death, the marsh, Horus as an infant, warm and nearly lost. Horus as a child with reed, cuts across his fingers from practicing too hard. Horus now, standing beyond her, trying to appear composed while carrying the whole future of legitimacy in his spine. The presiding voice spoke formally, but no one heard the flourishes as much as the center. Horus was recognized as the legitimate heir to Osiris. Set's claim was unlawful in origin and destructive in rule. Authority must return to the rightful line. Set reacted as only Set could. Not with dignity, not with repentance, with fury. The old red force rose around him again, storm gathering under a roof built for ceremony. And for one perilous instant, it seemed the verdict might be drowned in the very violence it had condemned. But the tribunal was ready now. Or rather, it was willing now, which is rarer and more useful. Combined authority struck down across the chamber. Protective wards flared. Divine power, not one voice but many, pressed against Set's uprising. Horus moved too, stepping between the throne line and the court, not from theatrical instinct, but because that is what rightful protectors do without rehearsing it. Set was forced back, bound not only by magic, but by the fact that his power, once judged openly, no longer wore legitimacy like armor. He could still wound, still rage, still threaten, but he had been named, and naming matters. His final fate belonged partly to judgment and partly to the logic of myth. Set would not vanish into nothing. Forces of desert, storm, confusion, and rupture do not disappear merely because justice wins a hearing. They are driven back, bounded, assigned their place. Some traditions would keep him in the cosmic order as necessary opposition. Others would remember him chiefly as the usurper cast down. What mattered in that hall was simpler. He would not rule. Horus was raised to the throne. The restoration itself unfolded with solemn splendor. Regalia returned to the rightful line. Sacred signs, once bent toward the wrong king, were corrected. Temple musicians resumed old sequences that had not been heard properly in years. Oil shone on stone. Priests carried standards. The air changed. It truly did. A kingdom under fear feels tight in the lungs. A kingdom breathing toward justice feels different even before the grain improves or the taxes ease. People stand a little straighter. That was the beginning. Yet the story does not belong to Horus alone, and the tradition never lets us forget that. His victory is impossible without Isis. Not merely because she gave him life, though she did. Not merely because she protected him, taught him, healed him, and argued him into history, though she did all of that too. The restoration of rightful order is in this myth, inseparable from the labor of a woman who refused to let catastrophe define the last meaning of love. And there is one more reason the old world loved her. One I think matters very much, for a story meant to be heard at the edge of sleep. Isis was accessible. Not easy, not soft in the foolish sense, but accessible. Other gods often seem to prefer distance. They like altars, hierarchy, formal steps. Isis can move in those places, certainly, but she can also move through kitchens, birthing rooms, field paths, river boats, sick beds, and dreams. Her myth contains palaces and tribunals. Yes, but also mud, milk, poison, reed huts, tired hands, and the infinite smallness of a mother bending over a child at dawn. That is why she endured. Grandeur alone impress. Grandeur mixed with usefulness becomes beloved. In the years that followed, the order restored under Horus carried clear traces of her teaching. Law did not forget mercy. Strength did not excuse itself from measure. Temples reopened to healing and study. Knowledge was treated once more as nourishment, and not merely as ornament for the powerful. The memory of Osiris remained, no longer as the broken body in a chest or wrapped chamber, but as king beyond death, ruler of the hidden western realm where souls are weighed. Thus, the family transformed catastrophe into structure. Osiris below, Horus in rule, Isis between worlds, stitching continuity where violence had tried to make permanent separation. There is something very Egyptian in that. Nothing wasted, not even grief. Everything placed. Everything given function. Loss made into ritual. Mourning made into law. Love made into cosmology. Still, for all the cosmic scale, the image that lingers most tenderly is not always the tribunal or the crown. It is sometimes Isis in the marsh, listening for danger while her child sleeps. Or Isis in the chamber, smoothing linen over the restored body of Osiris with hands that must not tremble. Or Isis in old age of worship, imagined by generations who had never seen her, but knew exactly what kind of presence they needed nearby when the world had grown cruel or uncertain. Not a distant thunderer, not a cold perfection. Someone who could search, gather, mend, conceal, teach, and wait without surrendering the shape of what was right. That is why the story survives, because it understands that chaos is real, usurpation is real, envy is real, and so is exhaustion. But it also insists that knowledge can outlast brute force, that devotion can become strategy, that motherhood can become statecraft, and that justice sometimes returns not as a sudden miracle, but as a child hidden long enough to grow strong. So tonight, when you imagine her, do not imagine only the jeweled crown or the wings spread wide on temple walls. Imagine also the reed smell of the delta, the hush of lamp smoke, the feel of cool stone in a tribunal before verdict, the small weight of an infant god held close against danger, the endless patient work of gathering what violence scattered. That is the real splendor of Isis. Not untouchability. Endurance shaped into blessing. The hall grows quiet now. The judges have gone. The storm has withdrawn to its proper distance. The rightful crown rests where it should. The mother who crossed death and marsh and law and memory stands at last in a peace she purchased dearly and never selfishly. The river breathes outside the palace walls. The stars hold their stations above Nut. The earth rests beneath Geb. Somewhere beyond sight, Osiris rules the hidden west with grave serenity. Horus keeps the daylight throne, and Isis, wise and watchful, remains where she has always been, most powerful, close to the wounded, close to the hopeful, close to anyone trying to turn fear back into order with steady hands. Let the old temple doors close softly now. Let the torches burn lower. Let the reeds go dark and silver under the moon. Let the falcon fold its wings. Let the mother finally set down the armor of urgency and keep only the quiet gold of presence. The story has carried you from first waters to final restoration, from birth to betrayal, from grief to healing, from hiding to rightful return. There is nothing left to chase, nothing left to prove, only the long, gentle hush after justice, and the feeling of a universe settling, at last, back into its breathing. Good night.